Hey there, Solar Warriors. I'm Nico Johnson, and this is Suncast. Each week, I pull back the veil on the life and business insights of clean tech entrepreneurs building the most noble and impactful companies of our time. I hope what you learn from this conversation is a catalyst for your own growth. So thanks for tuning in, and welcome to our tribe. Hey, welcome back, Solar Warrior. Thanks so much for lending us your ears and your only non-renewable resource, your time. This is part 2 of my interview with Silicon Ranch CEO Reagan Farr. If you missed part 1, well, you must have jumped right past it. So I'd encourage you to stop, go back to that one, and come back here. You're still listening, so I'm gonna assume you either like backward stories or you've already listened to the amazing backstory to how Silicon Ranch came into existence. In this part 2, Reagan and I get into the meat and potatoes of how they went to market to build far more than the 150 megawatts that first compelled him out of the starting blocks. You're going to learn what it really looks like to understand how policy can make or break a market, how Reagan and his co-founders selected the markets they would operate in, and how they ultimately attracted one of the largest multinational energy companies in the world to invest in their next phase of growth. I hope that you already subscribed to the show, but if you're still looking for a reason to stick around for more, well, this episode won't disappoint. And when you're ready, you can always check out the other 398 additional founder stories and startup advice over at mysuncast.com. I hope that you'll subscribe to the show in your podcast player, but also to my email over at the website, which comes out regularly, trying to help you navigate the clean energy economy. For now, get ready to tune up your skills, Solar Warrior, as we tune into another powerful conversation here on Suncast.
Reagan, at some point in your career, you had to make a decision. I'm going to stay in government, be a tax man, or going to follow a different path. Clearly, in hindsight, we can see that you followed a different path. Take me back to the moment where it became clear to you that your path was going to take you out of government and into creating something on your own, that final step into entrepreneurship.
I give a lot of credit to my 2 fellow co-founders because the natural off-ramp from being a commissioner of revenue is especially if you have a Big 4 background, is to go be a partner at a law firm or a Big 4 accounting firm. And had you asked me what my dream job was coming out of law school, I would have said I want to be a partner at a law firm or a Big 4 accounting firm. So it was interesting having mentors, and I think really it's so interesting. And if I have a goal for myself, it's to have the kind of impact on others that some of my mentors have had on me. Spending time with Governor Bredesen, getting to know him, he had really encouraged me to view my opportunity in state government as a chance to step off and do something different. He's like, you can always go be a partner at a Big 4 accounting firm. You can always go be a partner at a law firm. You only get the chance to try something new coming out of this platform once. And he said, I don't know what it's going to be, but you have had experiences that you should be able to think of something entrepreneurial that you want to do. So it was interesting. My good friend Matt Kisber and I had kind of had a gentleman's agreement. Let's do something entrepreneurial together. Because the obvious answer for Matt, he had been a vice president at a large bank, and that was kind of an obvious off-road for him. Go be an executive at a bank in business development or be a consultant for economic development. So we both kind of said we want to build something together. We had the most important thing for doing that, which I think is we had very similar moral compass, and we had a good underlying appreciation for each other's skills, which were quite complementary. So we were going to do something together. Governor Bredesen offered to be a mentor to us as we thought through a variety of opportunities. It was really through bouncing different ideas off the governor, talking to Matt, that one, I became convinced we're going to start a company. Two, I became more and more convinced that company was going to be a renewable solution provider company. It was interesting. We had other opportunities that we explored quite deeply. In fact, we even had lined up an investment for a whole different line of business. I always keep that. We submitted a term sheet to somebody to buy a company that we were going to take over and run and expand and grow, and we missed the bid by, I don't know, $500,000. And I said, man, there is a great data point for, had we hit that bid, we might not have had all the time and attention to focus on Silicon Ranch to grow this company into what we did. So,
would you mind sharing what line of business that was in?
Matt Kisber's family came out of the retail department store business back when they were family department stores. It was Kisber's department store, and they had been one of the first department stores in the South to offer in-store credit to minority families. So it became this regional store because people would say I could shop right downtown in my town, but if I go to Kisber's, I'm going to be treated with respect. I'll be able to buy things on credit, regardless of my race. So Matt had really been brought up in that retail business and had seen that business completely transformed by chain department stores. So his background, I always laugh. When we travel, he loves to shop. You can look at my wardrobe and say, this guy never shops. So it was interesting. It was a retail business that sold to businesses.
Reagan, given the arc of the story, it might be easy for folks to lose a sense of time scale. We haven't mentioned like year marks or age marks, but would you be willing to disclose roughly what age were you coming out of government when you were starting into this next phase in entrepreneurship?
Sure. So I was 39, and it's interesting. Matt Kisber and I are 10 years apart. We both are older fathers, so he's 10 years ahead of me in terms of marriage. So I always look to him and say, all right, where am I going to be in a decade? Look at Matt. But it was interesting. I had very young kids. My oldest was 3, and my youngest was born right as we were starting Silicon Ranch. It's a real commitment, and I think if you ask me a question, what did you not appreciate when you made this decision to start a company? It was how all-consuming it becomes if you really want to make it work. And you can't do it alone. It's you've got to have buy-in from your wife, from your children, from your family, because it's a heavy lift to start a company. I love the book Shoe Dog. You think of Nike, and it just seems like an inevitable success. And you read Shoe Dog and you realize he was struggling a decade in. Like there were still all of these intense, troubling times, challenges he had to work through. And you see how important his spouse was and his family was through that process. And one thing Matt and I have both had is our families have fully bought in to this effort. And it's interesting, part of why I love this company and this experience so much is my children are older now, and they're incredibly proud of what we're doing. My kids have both asked me all the time to come speak to their classes about
that's so sweet.
Renewables and the environment, and they come here a lot. This is their second home. They run around the office. It is amazing to look back and think about all of the different sacrifices, but then to realize they were all worth it. When you count, there's the mentors, there's the Governor Bredesen, there's Matt Kisber being my partner, but you really can't get here without your family being there for you. And
in particular, as you mentioned, a spouse who understands the vision and is bought in that the sacrifice is worth it, that the juice is worth the squeeze.
And it's interesting because even my wife's an only child, and her parents. I can't tell you how many family vacations we've been on when I've been on the phone and really really heated discussions and not being a great part of the vacation. And her parents have also been incredibly supportive and understanding.
Yeah, I've been there. A lot of my clients are there right now. They're listening and appreciating this conversation. It brings up another point, and I think this is a really crucial one. We hear all the time, all the stories of Silicon Valley. We're going to come back to Silicon as a theme, but Silicon Valley, the young startup culture of raising money and unicorns, but it's the vast majority of entrepreneurship does not rest on the shoulders of venture capital and private equity. It rests on the shoulders of hardworking families who reinvest their savings to get a business going, which is why 9 out of 10 businesses fail after 3 years. You guys have kept a business going for a decade in an extremely difficult but prosperous time in an extremely difficult industry where the incumbents are very, very willing to squash you. When you decided that you were going to start effectively an energy retail company or an energy development company, take on the establishment of traditional energy, did you have a thesis on how to fund that operation? And I'm asking very specifically at 39, was there a sense of we need this much capital to reach this scale? Or what a lot of people perhaps think is there's no way I'm going to touch my nest egg to start this thing, right? Like, help me think through the conversation that you and Kisber were having, and perhaps several of your mentors, including Governor Bredesen, were helping you navigate this discussion up front of the sense of scale that you wanted to achieve and how to financially get there.
When we started, I think you talk to all of these people who have been successful in business, and they all say if you execute on your business plan, there's plenty of money out there. Yeah. And that is at least for me, I was not fully bought into that reality. Yeah. To me, it was all, I had been fortunate to always have a good job. My wife's a successful professional, so we had a small nest egg, but it was a very precious one. Yeah. And so when we started the company and we did our first series of projects, it was the first renewable energy loans that any of our banking partners had made. And you would have thought we were trying to build a nuclear plant. They felt like it was this crazy cutting edge technology and they didn't know how they would underwrite it. So we had to personally guarantee all of our early projects. Our first projects were 200 kW rooftop projects, but then they grew and they grew. And I remember talking to my wife at one point, I was like, okay, I've guaranteed all of our liquid assets. Wow. Now I'm going to have to guarantee our illiquid assets, basically our house. And she said, okay, let's do it. We'll be fine. So, it was a very satisfying moment as the company evolved when we were finally able to retire all of the personal guarantees. All of us were in it together, Matt Kisber, myself, and Governor Bredesen. And, as the guarantees grew, quite frankly, there was this period of time where Matt and I were fully leveraged. Yeah. And it really was the governor's balance sheet that let us kind of bridge through to true commercialization. And not many co-founders would have done that. Yeah. He put a lot of faith in us. And I will tell you, one of the happiest days was when I got my personal guarantee off, but the happiest days when I got Governor Bredesen's off, because it just took a tremendous amount of pressure off of me as the one responsible for all of our loan facilities.
So Governor Bredesen pushed the first domino by saying, you and Matt should really go think about what you want to do together. And what I was surprised by, and I'm grateful for Kelly Pickrell's interview on Contractor's Corner, because it allowed me to get a sense of the early narrative. And I would encourage folks to go listen to that interview, because you tell a lot of fun stories as well. One that surprised me was that Governor Bredesen didn't start out on the journey with you. In fact, Matt didn't technically start out on the journey with you. You effectively went out and built the business plan, which candidly, like reading all of the things about the company, like you wouldn't find that out. So thank you for disclosing that. But tell me a bit about that first sort of 5 to 6 month period. Your wife's bought in, you and Matt have this tentative agreement, and it's mostly, I'm guessing, sort of spit in the palm handshake of like, we're going to do this. And then you've got something that Governor Bredesen goes, wait a minute, this is a thing. Bring me to that moment.
Wow. So, it's interesting. I left, my first day at Silicon Ranch was August 5th, 11 years ago. I left early. The company didn't officially kick into gear until January of the following year. Walking out, I had a check for $250,000, a mandate to get a business plan done, get a company set up, and have everything ready to hit the ground running when Matt Kisber's and Governor Bredesen's time in office ended. It was so early, I really spent the time doing a little bit of what you do. I just reached out to everyone I knew and said, I want to talk to you. Right? Tell me what it's like to run a business. Tell me what you thought was important, what wasn't. And reached out to a lot of unrelated companies and just said, tell me what you think about renewables. It was very daunting, but also incredibly exhilarating to wake up every day and say, I'm going to go learn something new. Putting the business plan on paper is a very good discipline. It was interesting. I would draft a draft and share it with the governor, and he would just say, you need to give a little more thought to this. Give me zero feedback other than give more thought to it. And I've never asked him. In fact, this interview may make me call him up. I don't even know if he read every draft. He was really just pushing me to say, have you thought as deeply about this as you need to have? And then there's just the unglamorous side of setting a business up, getting so you can do payroll, withholding tax, and setting up an accounting and a phone system. None of that's intuitive. And I was stepping from an organization in state government where I had tremendous administrative support. All of a sudden, too, I had none. So it's something that I really empathize and admire all entrepreneurs. And you totally see how the statistics play out of almost all startups fail. And then you realize why venture capital and private equity funders don't care and say, we want someone that's tried, failed, but they're going to be better the second time, because you learn so much going through it the first time. It's truly, just because it's not successful at the first at bat, I guarantee you've pocketed a lot of lessons that'll pay dividends later.
Yeah, we talked about a little bit this before we started the tape. My 4 post-MBA MBAs, which are effectively business failures. And now, against all odds, at like 42, I'm now like invited to be a board member of companies that I respect. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what have I earned? And the answer is like School of Hard Knocks, like bruises and bumps and scrapes and cuts. It's something that in the middle of the process of fleshing it out, you don't fully appreciate what you're learning. And actually, I'm convinced that you don't even have context until you get into maybe the next thing and you go, wait a minute, these guys don't understand this thing's going to happen. And you almost have this ability to future cast, like you see that pattern recognition. I don't want to gloss over, you mentioned $250,000 coming from somewhere.
Yeah, so that was the initial investment into Silicon Ranch.
Okay, and did that come from Governor Bredesen?
Came from Governor Bredesen.
Wow. Okay. Did you and Matt, I hope it's okay with you for me to ask this, but did you and Matt contribute equity in the beginning of the company?
Not in the beginning. Later we did, and then we also guaranteed the debt.
Right.
No, initially the arrangement was we were all equal partners.
Yeah.
Matt and I were going to do the work, and Governor Bredesen was going to do the first. So it was a $500,000 commitment. So
was there a moment where he was like, "Oh well, no, I want in"?
It was more when we were talking about the different opportunities. Shared with him the business concept for what became Silicon Ranch. When he was, the governor is an incredibly savvy businessman. I think he has an uncanny ability to say, this is the next big thing. And he's a real believer, and I've become a huge disciple of this too. If you're in the right space and just feeling around, you're going to have a better chance of success than being in the wrong space with the best idea you could possibly have. His view was, I don't know if your business plan's exactly right, but you're in the right space and you're asking the right questions. So go quit talking about it and go do it. And that's really, I think that's really great advice for any startup. One neat thing about having mentors is everyone's got all of this experience. And it was interesting. the governor would always give me advice, and then he'd have a little funny story behind it. And I think that's the best way to internalize that advice.
Right.
But one of the things, we were sitting around in a small windowless conference room, and we were saying, what do we want to name this company? The governor said, I've started a lot of successful companies in my life. The hardest, most debated question in every one of them is, what do we name it? We were all going to make a list and then come back collectively, share our list, and vote to see which company name we went with. And it was kind of early in the space, so my list was like solar this, sun that, and I was going on the internet to make sure the domain names weren't taken.
You're looking for Greek names, you're looking for Italian and Latin.
So it was so funny. I was at the office pinging my list together, and Matt had gone home, and by the time I drove home, the governor had already called Kisber and said, hey, check your email. Matt called me, he's like, Reagan, check your email. The governor had not only come up with Silicon Ranch, he had designed the logo and emailed it to us. And he's like, don't feel obligated. This is just the first thing, but I kind of like this one. So we're like, well, that is the company name and that's the logo.
Amazing.
And it is funny because I have really become fond of the logo.
Yeah.
It was funny. Everyone loves the name except for First Solar. They don't like that it's silicon.
Of course.
Was it intentional of Governor Bredesen that the mountain range goes up and to the right?
Yes. He's a very thoughtful guy. He's an artist.
Yeah.
And he's a big fan of the West. So I think the whole concept of the ranch and then the sun over the mountains, it really speaks to how the opportunity is there. And it's dovetailed so well with our regenerative energy practices that we've really worked hard to roll out for the industry. So I'm very grateful. I always tell Governor Bredesen, we have now trademarked the Silicon Ranch thing, and he's like, where's my royalty?
Yeah.
And I was like, it is my friendship and a never-ending supply of coffee here at the office.
One of the things that I dwell on as I think about how to help my co-founding clients, I mostly work with small companies that are co-founders trying to figure out how to scale their businesses, and it's not always obvious that they're the right co-founder match. What does Kisber offer you in terms of complementary skills?
So Matt and I'm a very analytical person. I'm also horrible with names. Kisber is all about retail, and he's great with names. And he's, he would say a statesman.
Sure, of course. I'll take that back. He's a statesman.
I would agree with it.
I mean, you can't become the youngest legislator in state history, maybe even U.S. history, at 22 without having a remarkable amount of charisma and sort of like, so name recollection. So
I brought a heavy finance, tax equity is a big part of the capital stack for solar financing. So I brought that technical background. I'm an attorney, so I was very, very focused on making sure our contractual frameworks were correct. Matt really had that outward looking, how do we position ourselves in the marketplace? How do we distinguish ourselves? When we hired Matt Beasley, who's our chief commercial officer, he took what Matt Kisber had done and took it to the next level.
Yeah.
And I had a real appreciation that I didn't have before. You can get all the fundamentals right, but if you don't have your story down, it doesn't matter. It's very easy when you're just starting out to totally focus on your product and not focus on how you're positioning your product to the public and what your story is.
Yeah.
Through it all, I think the fact that Matt and I are still dear friends, in addition to business partners, it just really speaks to how complementary and how well we've worked together, because there's challenges as you grow a company. And at different time, different people's skill sets monetize in completely different ways. And you've just got to be comfortable that everybody's contributing in a different way, as long as you're advancing the ball toward where you want to be.
I'm fascinated by, having grown up in the South, I'm fascinated that a company like Silicon Ranch came about at the time that it did, a time where it was almost perfect timing. Not that you saw that necessarily, but perfect timing. And as we look back, 2011 was really the inflection point where prices plummeted. Governments were starting to invest across the United States, not just North Carolina and California. And yet The Southeast, where I grew up, 7 cent a kilowatt hour electricity, seemed like the last bastion, like the last place solar would ever take off. And in retrospect, as I look at the map, and I'm going to take a photo of this and post it as a part of this blog post, the map of where you all have developed the bulkhead or the beachhead of your projects and then the bulk of your volume, it is focused in a territory that most other solar developers thought was near impossible to break into. I come back to what we crafted in part one as this macroeconomic understanding of economic development, the importance of tax incentives, the importance of understanding how government, in particular state government, has and continues to vastly influence the ability for our industry to gain a foothold and scale. But what conviction within the team, you, Governor Bredesen, Matt Kisber, allowed you and your investors, which is not insignificant, to be the first into Georgia, the first into Mississippi, candidly, like one of the biggest investors into my home state of South Carolina, as we'll talk about in a minute. Help me understand. I mean, it seems to me like a kind of against all odds type of business proposition that if I look back when I was first hearing about Silicon Ranch, I was thinking, how the hell is this Nashville-based company building projects in TVA and making and like what's their vision? And why aren't they in Arizona? Why aren't they in New Mexico? Why aren't they in California? Why aren't they in Nevada? Help me understand your vision for the Southeast in particular. One
thing that both Matt Kisber and I, and under Governor Bredesen's leadership, found the state of Tennessee had a very limited economic development budget. So constitutionally, we couldn't redirect money to a private company. So oftentimes, and I think of the Volkswagen recruitment, all kinds of states wanted Volkswagen's North American manufacturing plant. A lot of states just had closing funds where they could say, write you a check for $200 million, put your plant here and spend it how you want. We couldn't do that. We had to say, what can we do given the tools that we have in our toolkit that might be different? And a skill that you learn, and this is something that I think it's an easy, obvious thing, but we would ask, what is it you're really trying to achieve? And then we may not be able to write you a big check, but we've got all these other tools that we can bring to bear to help you achieve your goals. And, ultimately, that was a very successful way of recruiting industry to our state. And it's how we engaged with utility companies early on when it was counterintuitive that solar would be developed here in the Southeast. We've got good solar resource here. We have low power prices, but companies still wanted to have access to renewable electrons. Our view was, let's partner with the utilities who have all of the established infrastructure, who have the established customer relationships, and help them solve that customer need in a way that's a win for all the parties. And that was not the prevailing view of the industry at that point in time. The prevailing views where you've got to beat these utilities over the head. You either need to put a renewable portfolio standard on them, which a lot of the states out west did, or you need to have puts to them with a QF system like they had in North Carolina. So I feel like we developed a skill set very early on of listening to the end customer, the end user, but also sitting down with utility companies and saying, how can we solve this issue in a way that works for everyone involved? Frankly, some of the structure of our PPAs was 100% geared toward how do we make this work economically in a way that can be financed under the investment tax credit in a way that lets Silicon Ranch get the returns that it needs. So the collaborative nature and being very disciplined with our capital. I think sometimes one of the things that is wrong with a lot of startup companies, they get too much capital right up front and they're just not disciplined with it, and they think it's always going to be easy to raise that next round. We really started our company, capital was precious. It was the capital of people we knew that I would see, and we treated it like that precious resource. So we were very intentional, and early on, we did some incredibly creative things. We leveraged new market tax credits. We leveraged insurance tax credits. We did financing structures that won national awards because of their creativity. As we scaled, that became more difficult. But it shows you that if you really focus on what your end game is, which is solving the problem for your customers and your partners, you can start solving everything else at the same time.
You've been able to unlock markets that others have arguably tried very hard and sort of come into and float out of. You mentioned TVA early on. Developers were here and then they were gone and now they're trying to come back. But one of the cornerstones of your development thesis is lean into and develop the cooperative utilities, the cooperative model of energy generation and distribution. Can you tie that back to sort of the core philosophy of Silicon Ranch as a community development organization, an economic development organization? And why do co-ops marry to the vision of the company in a way that maybe traditional IOUs don't?
Sure. So I'll start with TVA, but you threw them out first. Sure. It's our home utility. So TVA was really built on a three-legged stool of low-cost, reliable power, flood control, and very importantly, economic development as part of their core mission. And our approach with TVA was, even when they really stepped back from procuring renewables and most of the industry left the state, Silicon Ranch stayed very involved. I mean, our chief commercial officer was the head of Tennesseea. There was one point where we were almost the entire membership of Tennesseea. And we kept telling TVA, you need to stay engaged in the solar space because ultimately it's an economic development tool. If you're going to recruit the type of industry to the valley that you want, you're going to have to create tools around renewable energy or you're just not going to be successful. And that collaboration, I like to think that we had a role in crafting some very successful programs that TVA has rolled out and that allowed them to recruit the Googles and the Facebooks and now the Amazons and the Oracles. We stayed engaged. If you don't take a long-term partnership, collaborative view, you would have never invested those years of constant dialogue. And to TVA's credit, a lot of the individuals that are leading the procurement efforts now and that are lauded at these conferences, they sat up on panels and just took nothing but abuse for years from the industry. Sometimes I would say even crossing the line to the point of disrespect for someone who's working in a public power company. And I think you don't do that when you take a partnership longer-term view. Yeah. For the co-ops, they serve the supermajority of the real estate in the country. And I'm from the Southeast, you're from the Southeast. I think the rural co-ops basically serve the majority of our part of the world.
That's right.
In a lot of communities, the co-op is, they also host, they've got the conference center for the entire community. Yeah. They're member-owned, they're mission-driven, and economic development and quality of life is a part of the reason for their existence. So our view of becoming members of the community where we invest, of long-term collaborative partnership and improving the communities where we build our projects align so perfectly with the cooperative mission, vision, and value. I always say, I will do business with the investor-owned utilities, but anytime I have to choose how to allocate my resources, we're going to focus on the co-ops because there's such an alignment of what I think our industry can deliver, how I want to create value at Silicon Ranch, and how important it is to improve the communities where we build, that the co-ops are the right partners to do that, and TVA is a great partner to do that as well.
In our previous conversation, for those who are following sequentially, this is part 2 of our conversation, you referred to the way that economic development was attempted in your home state of Louisiana, the negative externalities of oil and gas. I've heard you use a term that I'm not sure was necessarily coined by you. Perhaps it was. If so, genius again to your marketing team's credit and Governor Bredesen, of regenerative energy. Can you help me understand how Silicon Ranch is contributing to positive externalities in the community you just mentioned? How does regenerative energy work in practice? What does it mean? Do you own the term? Is it trademarked?
It actually is, and I give a lot of credit to we have a lot of Matts in our company. Matt Kisber is my co-founder and the chairman of our board, and Matt Beasley is our chief commercial officer. And Matt Beasley was with me when we first went to White Oak Pastures and learned about the regenerative ranching movement in the food space. And I know you're a Michael Pollan fan. I'm a big Michael Pollan fan. We went down really because we do a lot of business with the co-ops in Georgia. We had bought a piece of land where we were going to put a large solar facility, not even knowing that there was a regenerative rancher right next door to us. And the regenerative rancher had read about our project in the media, had reached out to the co-ops and said, I want to meet these guys. We have to talk. We have to talk some shop.
Yeah.
He was concerned we were going to be using herbicides and pesticides next to his ranch that had been operating in a regenerative way for over 2 decades.
What does it mean to have a regenerative ranch?
So it is a movement where it's not just organic. You're truly managing the land and your livestock in a way that you're regenerating the quality of the soil.
Yeah.
And improving the land, not just maintaining the quality of the land.
Sure.
So it's more than we're not using these negatives, it's we're doing things that actually improve it.
I get it. Pollan does it in his book, talks with Joel Salatin, who obviously is
Polyface, another big, another well-known name in that space.
In the regenerative. Okay, so I'm connecting the dots here now. And so maybe in a phrase, how does Beasley describe regenerative energy in that regard?
So we talk about it as we are generating renewable energy, taking the sun and turning it into renewable electrons. But we're not capturing all of the sunlight. A lot of it's hitting the ground. And we have another opportunity. We can regenerate the soil that our solar arrays are covering. Yeah. So by managing the land, and we're a big landowner, and this industry is going to own millions of acres, or at least manage millions of acres over time. We said we have a responsibility to not just maintain the land, we want to improve the land where we're putting our projects. So we have built a whole team out and continue to refine the practices and make them available to others, where we regeneratively manage the land that we own in a way that we're sequestering more carbon, improving the quality of the plant life, managing it in a way that impacts the ag community in the areas where we locate. And it's one of the more rewarding activities that I've been involved in. It's funny, I looked at my bedside table this morning and I was getting up, and kind of a serial reader, so I always have a stack of books over there. And I was like, 3 of them are on regenerative farming. Wow. One's on how to be a better manager, and then one's my to-do list, which was at the bottom. So it's, I'm completely intrigued with this movement, because while what we're doing in the power sector is very necessary, we also need to really be looking at the agricultural sector and say how can industrial farming improve its environmental impact. And I think regenerative practices are going to be a big part of that. And the fact that I sit in a chair and this company sits in a chair where we can both advance renewable energy and regenerative land management is, I think, the best of both worlds.
So as I mentioned, part of the impetus for and the opportunity to come to Nashville and sit down with you is that you have accomplished in many ways, like the impossible task of keeping a company open for 10 years, and not just open, but scaling. We'll talk a bit about the scale in a moment. But 10 years of progress is a remarkable milestone. First of all, congratulations. I'd love to hear, what have you learned about the energy business over the last decade that you would love to tell your 39-year-old self?
What I've come to appreciate in my experience is change is stressful for everybody. I have a personality where I embrace change. It excites me, and it makes me think about what the opportunities are. The utility industry for a very long time has been an industry without much change. It was all about finding operational efficiencies. So people who went into the power industry historically did that because it was a safe, steady career that had a rewarding profession. You could work at it for 30 years. And it's one of the few things where with a lot of them you could retire with a pension. And I don't think I appreciated early on. I was such an advocate of this change is coming. It's a triple net benefit. Get excited about it. I don't think I had enough empathy always for the person sitting on the other side of the table from me at the utility company who viewed this energy revolution as a challenge to the career that they had entered into. They didn't get into that space to embrace change.
Yeah.
I think I would have been a little more patient in some of my meetings had I had a bit more empathy and insight about what I viewed as an opportunity could be viewed as a threat by others.
Yeah, and it clearly is now in hindsight. You shared a fantastic story. We'll see if maybe we can get the script notes version of that, of a conference you went to where it was illustrative of that point. A CFO was speaking right before you. Would you share a bit of that story?
Sure. I was invited to an industry conference where it was really limited to the executives of power and utility companies. I was there as a guest speaker, and it was actually a closed door session, but I got to come in early to hear the presenter before me, who was talking to them about changes going on in the space. And sitting in the back room of a large conference center, I was looking at the audience, and it's predominantly male audience, all executives at power companies. The age in the room probably averaged out in the early 60s. And they were talking about, this was still early, kind of middle of the solar journey. Solar was just starting to become very cost competitive with fossil-based fuels across the country. It was really the first instance where I saw these people kind of feeling free to discuss. They worked at probably one of the best employers in their community. They were viewed as community leaders. They had good jobs, and all of them had retirement. The vast majority of them, I would say, had retirement probably less than 10 years into the future. I really appreciated there was a sentiment that they didn't want to hear the cost curves on solar are coming down much quicker than anyone anticipated. This is going to be happening. This change is coming to your geography sooner than you anticipated. It was really, everybody was hoping, we think solar is a good thing, but I don't want it to happen on my watch. It can happen after. We can do a couple of demonstration projects. It was real eye-opening, and it helped me to understand how we as an industry need to collaboratively work with our co-op partners and our utility partners, because it is a challenge. They've got legacy fossil facilities that are not cost competitive. They've got a lot of debt on those facilities. So it's a big change, and we're going from a centralized power generation concept based on fossil fuels to a distributed generation concept based on renewables. It's going to take a lot of thought leadership, a lot of collaboration, and I'm not sure our side of the industry, the renewable side, has truly embraced the partnership with the traditional power side.
Yeah, let that story sink in. We didn't talk about economics. Knowing roughly the time period, I imagine some of these projects were being pulled across the finish line at somewhere in the $70 to $80 megawatt hour range. And I could almost imagine sitting in that room, and you can almost hear the sound of that gold watch hitting the floor, right? That 30-year target, their career careening off the perilous edge of where the hell is this industry going and how are we going to keep up? It's fascinating to think about, and I really appreciate, and I hope that folks are paying attention to the intention with which you're communicating right now, that as an industry, we have an opportunity to either burn or build bridges, right?
Without a doubt. This change is inevitable, but it can be much smoother if we really work in collaboration to invest wisely as we transition our energy infrastructure.
Hey, want to protect your margins and get projects over the line fast? Look, we all know solar development teams waste millions of dollars every year on inefficient development. We both know that the old school methods of engaging with stakeholders, collaborating on documents, and even pitching investors is literally starving you of the one thing that you won't get back: time. You need greater velocity in your deals that only comes from tried and true duplicatable processes so your margins aren't constantly under attack. And in an increasingly competitive marketplace where even big oil's getting in on the green gold rush, the right software will help keep your team focused and in control of what really matters. Lucky for you, Enian Project Manager is purpose-built software made for developers by developers. Sign up for free now and start moving faster with software made just for you. Go to enian.co and see what Enian Project Manager can do for you. That's ENIAN.co.
I'm curious, you guys are sitting on 2.5 gigawatts of pipeline and built projects and to be built projects. As you look out on the landscape for the next 10 years, what really excites you the most about the possibilities?
Well, first I want to say it's over 3.5 gigawatts.
Fantastic. I stand corrected.
And growing at a pace that surprises, I think, everyone who's not intimately involved in the industry. I've always said, from my work scholastically, from my experience, we don't deal well with exponential change. Yeah. We're very linear in our thinking, just as a species almost. And I think the growth that this industry is experiencing, nobody's prepared for.
Yeah.
I really think that's the challenge of all the industry, is to really wrap their arms around how quickly we're scaling and the magnitude of what we have to accomplish together to continue to scale successfully. Because our challenge will be if, as a whole, we start failing in delivering these facilities the way that we've committed to deliver them. This industry has been bailed out, I think, time and time again by cost de-escalation happening much quicker than anyone ever. So if you made a bad bet,
it's really interesting way
you probably got bailed out with time.
Yeah.
There's not as much room for that to continue to happen, and we've used a lot of the low-hanging fruit from an interconnection standpoint, from an easy-to-build permitting standpoint, and I think the industry is growing quicker as things become a bit more difficult. So we all are going to have to sharpen our game a bit. I think you'll see some of the cats and dogs that have managed to find a home. I think you'll start to see the industry become more institutionalized as we go forward.
Funny you should mention that. I'll come back to the idea of institutionalizing the industry and the bridges that we're building. But first, I want to return to a previous piece of our conversation, someone that we both admire who's built a brand that anyone would recognize by its mark alone, Nike and Phil Knight. You talked about getting to that 10-year point, and Phil Knight disclosing in his book, at least, that he's still struggling to make things work. They're against all odds, like Nike still had a lot of uphill climb to do. And I wonder, we can sit here and celebrate the last 10 years, but at the 10-year mark, is there anything that you are particularly, and maybe you and Kisber are struggling to wrap your arms around and we as an industry need to be thinking about?
It took us almost 6 years to contract our first gigawatt of pipeline. We're going to contract over a gigawatt, probably maybe even 2 gigawatts this year. The scale of what you have to do is changing so rapidly. And how do you build a robust organization that can handle that rapid scaling? This is a young industry, so it's interesting. Every one of our employees in certain skill sets are recruited daily by other players in the space. And that can only work so well for so long.
That's right.
At some point, we've got to start developing a pipeline of talent. And I think we've probably not done a good job because developing talent takes time, takes failing. And all of us have such aggressive growth targets. The easy button is hire from
your competitor.
We've got to grow the base.
I love that answer. We talked privately about my belief that we have a human capital problem in the energy business broadly. What are your thoughts at Silicon Ranch about the bridge that we could be building to our friends who, like the utility industry, thought they had that 30-year career track and a gold watch at Chevron or Shell or BP, and they suddenly find themselves as stranded assets.
One thing I love about sitting in this chair is focusing on building out the team has become very important. And I always tell people, if you talk to investors or partners, they're like, what's your pipeline? What's your contracted cash flows? I always say, what's our team look like? I was like, the team is still the value of what we've built. The assets, at our growth rate, this asset base will be quite small versus what this team will deliver in the future. Some of the most successful things that we've done have been creating channels to bring talent into our organization. So the veteran programs have been incredibly successful. I think it would be interesting to create a pipeline. All of the traditional fossil companies have been downsizing as they prepare for an energy transition to, frankly, a lower margin business. The power business is lower margin than the fossil business. Something like the Veterans Program, where you bring these skilled individuals who have had to solve complex problems, bring them into the industry, would be a very meaningful undertaking. It's something, I don't know of an official channel that's out there that's doing it yet.
We've danced around a topic that, for those of us in the industry, are very well aware that Silicon Ranch has, you've raised a lot of money. You've built a lot of projects. You have, through the tenure of the 10 years of building this platform, as we call it in the industry, had some very good institutional partners as investors. Yet in, I think it was late 2018, early 2019, Shell, global oil and gas organization, invested heavily into Silicon Ranch. Can you help those of us who kind of look at that and think, on the one hand, that's interesting. I wonder what's going on there, like why that makes sense for Silicon Ranch or Shell. Two, there are folks who, no matter who you are, like when Lightsource, sold part of their business or most of it to BP, would say, oh, they're selling out to oil and gas. It's the easy pipeline. What's your response to the ability to scale, like we've talked about for the last 15, 20 minutes, by partnering with a global organization like Shell?
So I'm a firm believer. I told you, I think people always think of linear growth and not exponential growth and what the industry needs to do. We gave a lot of thought. If you listen to the Contractor Corners podcast, we talked to Shell for a year before we pulled the trigger on that transaction, because we had very good capital partners. Partners Group was an investor in Silicon Ranch, a Swiss-backed pension fund. We had great board members from Partners Group and a really good access to inexpensive capital with them. We partnered with Shell for strategic reasons.
Yeah.
And I think, much like I said, if I looked back and could have changed something with my younger self, it would have been having a bit more empathy for the people on the other side of the table in the utility space who viewed this sea change as a threat and not an opportunity. I would say, while the leadership of these oil and gas companies are all saying the right things, they're like the Department of Revenue, there's a whole infrastructure of tens of thousands of people below them that didn't sign up for this change. They signed up for a career with an oil and gas company that's very well respected, and I'm sure they were the top of their class. So you've got to earn and bring not just the leadership along, because I think they're there. You've got to bring the tens of thousands of team members along. I always think that's better done in collaboration than trying to club them over the head with bad publicity or with. So to me, all of these endeavors, the scale of a Shell versus the scale of the entire solar industry, Shell dwarfs it.
Yeah.
So being able, I view Shell as having a lot of tools in a toolkit that I could not develop myself, even if I had 5 years and limitless money.
Yeah.
I think that is a huge strategic advantage as we try to meet the needs of these customers that are driving change that dwarf Shell. I mean, the customers moving our industry forward are still the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebooks. If you don't have scale, you can't meet their needs.
While I can appreciate the ambitious entrepreneurial vision, I'm going to just play the devil's advocate here and say, how are the small, scrappy team relatively of Silicon Ranch really going to impact an overall, like, sort of indoctrinate or influence a big organization like Shell versus the opposite, right? Like, how do you, as the CEO, avoid Shell effectively influencing the way you operate rather than you giving them an opportunity to learn how the new economy operates?
So we were quite purposeful in our engagement with Shell. So Shell's a major owner of Silicon Ranch, but they're a minority owner. They're very open to, frankly, understanding that this transition's happening. It's happening quicker than they anticipated too. They're right in this. They're brilliant people. They've got an incredible scenario planning group. But I think the change in this industry is happening faster than anyone would have guessed. And if you ever interview a guest that says, no, I knew this was happening, I want to meet them and get us on a panel together. So if you think about it, this is a 100-plus-year-old company, and you can kind of stack all the traditional oil companies in this category. They're dividend companies. They're sitting here with a business model that's worked incredibly well for an incredibly long time. They're part of probably all of our IRAs and 401ks, whether we know it or not, if we're invested in index funds. They know they need to change. They lack, they're built, all of these companies are built to accomplish complex projects while mitigating risk and promoting safety. They're very responsible companies. This is not that industry. We talked a little bit about decision velocity. This is an industry where you have got to make decisions, execute on your game plan, and then be ready to pivot. Just the oil and gas companies aren't built for that. They are, I think, and it was interesting, I was just talking to James Brooks yesterday, who was with BP Lightsource and joined Shell not that long ago. It is a sea change for all of these traditional companies, what they're doing. They're all doing it at varying levels of success, and they're very different business models. And I think if you're not in the tent, in partnership, and validating, the good thing, Silicon Ranch was a good fit for Shell because we have a safety culture. We have, our values are on the wall, and they're very aligned with Shell's stated values, and we didn't change those. Those were our values from the founding of the company. We can help pull them along. Is it hard to get Shell to adjust? Well, they're a giant battleship. Yes, it's hard, but there's commitment at the top. We engage as a relatively small company vis-a-vis Shell. We engage with the very senior leadership of Shell, and I can tell you they're committed to succeeding, and they've got to in this energy transition. I think all these companies are trying to figure out how do they integrate, and this will be the sea change that I really think the second any of these companies can really put all the pieces together, you're really going to see the power of partnership. You've not seen it. BP hasn't done it. Total hasn't. None of these companies have figured out the full integration and solution offering, but we will figure it out. And when you do, we're going to be able to offer products that are going to become like the iPhone. It's just going to be the easy button for the companies out there that want to procure renewables.
For those who are unfamiliar, just a little bit of history and context. In 2018, not just Shell, but BP and others went on a buying spree. It was the year of M&A of platforms by the oil and gas industry, by and large, by traditional energy, we'll say. About the same time, they bought a minority stake in you guys for $217-ish million, as reported. They also invested to acquire British platform, sort of following British Petroleum's lead, or BP, roughly around the same. I mean, the dollar amount is remarkably similar. BP invests about $200 million in Lightsource. They buy First Utility for $200 million. They invest $217 million with you all for about a 44% stake. And at the same time, it's amazing the war chest they have. It's unbelievable. They're acquiring green lots. They're investing in storage. They're expanding the R&D, like their ability to assimilate technology and make decisions at a rate that like baffles most development platform companies. So I wanted to like just have folks really understand that this is not like a 2021 conversation. This has been happening since 2014, 2015, 2017, 2018, where the traditional energy business, who effectively launched the renewable energy business and suppressed it 35 years ago, has seen the sea change, has invested. I say that also so that folks can really comprehend, like, of the U.S. traditional platforms, you guys are, against all odds, like such a legitimate player that the companies that BP and Shell are acquiring overseas are for like majority stake is a minority stake in your business. I mean, and sometimes I'm like looking at this going, this is a remarkable statement about what Silicon Ranch has been able to accomplish. And I think it goes back to the concept that we've alluded to without having to get into your shorts on like what your RFP strategy and things like that are around economic development. Again, I just applaud you at your ability to preserve the momentum and the equity returns for your initial investors, for your team, in a way that a company that we've watched acquire many of our friends' companies, right, in whole or in part, would say, we believe so much in your platform that we are going to that we want to be a part of it. We just want to play in your space, right? And you are now a major foothold back into, so for a European-based company, back into the United States market. What does that say about, from BP and Shell, about the U.S. market as a foothold, as a global bellwether for what's happening in the renewables and the clean energy transition?
Shell has committed to reaching C0 by 2050. They've put nearer term goals on as well and tied executive compensation to it. If the way they're accounting scope 1, 2, and 3, Shell accounts for 3% of global carbon emissions.
Wow.
That is an incredible number. So you're going to see Shell doing a lot of different things, but in order to, they're still going to be a fossil company. So as they transition to being a power company, and they've done this branding change, Renewable Power Solutions, you can't hit the scale that they need to hit without being majorly successful in the U.S. marketplace. And they've got the infrastructure with their trading platform in Houston, CENA, to really facilitate meaningful scale in the U.S. And I think, I'm a tax guy. To the extent we've gotten something right around energy policy in the U.S., I think the investment tax credit is a much better vehicle for promoting solar deployment than a feed-in tariff, because in a feed-in tariff in this industry, you're always going to get that number wrong. You overpay and you create a flood of projects, then you shut it down, and it creates an ebb and flow mentality of deployment. I think the ITC was brilliant in that it benchmarks off of capital cost. The way that it's administered really through lending institutions and tax equity providers, you kind of do some built-in quality checks on the whole process, because no one wants to put tax equity into a bad project. So I do think we've gotten that right as a country, and it makes the U.S. a unique investment case globally for solar deployment and wind deployment, for that matter.
Coming back to the markets that you've intentionally invested in, historically red markets, Republican-led, why do you think that traditional red states like Texas, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, South Carolina are starting to, and even Tennessee, starting to lead the renewables revolution in the United States? And what do you think about that?
So one thing you learn very quickly in politics is economic development is the one thing both parties agree on across the board. The biggest challenge in every state in the country is rural economic development. The cities, almost across the board in urban areas, are doing well. It's really the rural part of America that's struggling from an economic development perspective. The fact that solar can be a part of the solution for supporting rural economic development speaks incredibly well across political lines. And we, from day one, have focused on the economic development impact of our investments and our long-term partnership approach, much more so than we focused on the environmental aspects of the offering. Those are there, but what we talk about is our positive impact on communities. And that has worked well with both parties. And I think is really why you're seeing solar development have such great success in a lot of these red states.
I don't want to leave out a context that I introduced because I'm from South Carolina about how hard it is to develop in markets where traditional energy has a foothold. Co-ops have to wrap their heads around how this works for them, especially in an economic environment where the wholesale cost of power and the avoided cost of power is so low traditionally. So let's take South Carolina as an example. I want to ask a couple of questions around that, and you can use it as a model. So it was recently announced, I think 450 megawatts of awards, of which you guys got a large portion of it. I don't know if it was a lion's share. And I understand that there's probably more opportunity to come, not just in South Carolina, but the Southeast. South Carolina as a state that is, partially divided into Duke territory and Santee Cooper as an electric cooperative, has a lot of different influences, a lot of things that you have to navigate to really understand developing or putting together a campaign, a development thesis. How did Silicon Ranch approach that state differently than competitors that perhaps gave you a foothold and advantage? And how long, for those who don't understand it at all, how long, for context, does something like that take?
We look at all the different markets and take a view on what do we bring to the table that's unique, that can position us for success there. One thing that, as South Carolina is very close to, it's our backyard. The co-ops serve a lot of that service territory. They were, like Georgia Power and some of the Georgia co-ops, they were building one of the last, they were building in effort on a large nuclear power plant that was having cost overruns and issues. We knew economic development's happening in South Carolina. It's one of those rapidly growing states.
Large agriculture state as well.
Large agricultural state. So we had been talking to them, frankly, as a resource about how to think of solar as an economic development tool. And what we did with some of our partners in Georgia is we actually proactively drafted an entire toolkit, kind of leveraging some of our tools from when we were in state government and economic development, and gave it to our utility partners and said, here's your solar renewable energy economic development toolkit. So through that work in Georgia, we were introduced to the co-ops in South Carolina, who were very curious to learn more about our approach. They basically said, we're not there yet, but we're interested in solar. It's going to be part of our future. And this was 4 or 5 years ago that we were having these discussions. So we started basically trying to serve as a resource, both to their economic development teams and to the utilities, waited for the whole Santee Cooper nuclear issue to kind of play through. But we also, as a long-term developer, owner, operator, we really like to own the real estate. It's kind of part of what distinguishes us from a lot of our competitors. So when we were talking to the South Carolina co-ops, started looking for and signing purchase options for large tracts of land next to good transmission. When the time came, so after 4 years of dialogue, developing these real estate assets and filing the interconnection agreements, when the opportunity came for them to do some procurement, you referenced 450 megawatts. Silicon Ranch got almost half of that. And I think it's going to be a new emerging market. South Carolina it's got a lot of attributes that businesses are looking for. Yeah. And renewables is going to play a really large role. And I think you've seen now the nuclear plant's probably not going to come online. So there's actual power supply issues too in renewables.
And it's getting rate-based. To boot.
Yes. Well, that's, it's interesting. I always tip my hat and say, while TVA was getting pounded by the solar industry for not procuring solar during this period, their CEO did bring on successfully one of the only nuclear power plants that have been successfully brought on in the past decade. So they were focused on what they needed to be focused on, because that would have been a bit expensive failure had they not done that.
Yeah, having grown up in the era where large companies like BMW and Caterpillar were attracted to South Carolina on the premise of not only the economic development incentives, but also the very cheap power to manufacture. And through the lens of this conversation, it makes complete sense to me. And for those of you who've listened for a long time, you'll start to tie together really important pieces. So all the way back in January, we talked to Sheldon Kimber, someone who's had tremendous success as well, building infrastructure, where he talked about the need, the mandate as a society to drive electric power costs as close to zero as possible so that we can scale at home and not depend on other countries, so that we can reduce the amount of logistics, so we can reduce the amount of CO2 embedded in, the carbon embedded in our products. The opportunity that opens for jobs in South Carolina, the opportunity that opens for manufacturing that's attracted to the Southeast broadly. I think that a lot of folks in the general, like I'll say like at the surface level of development game that maybe don't have the economic development, government office experience, don't necessarily see some of the things that are moving at the macroeconomic levels that make this all make sense. I recently had a conversation with Ram Ambadapudi, who's at EV Connect, but he was the guy who basically, you remember, he led Chevron's solar development, almost 3 gigawatts of power. And he said that the strength of Chevron and his strategy was to get designed in. And that's exactly the process that you all engaged in with your counterparts in South Carolina by giving them a playbook and effectively showing them, here is some criteria you may want to consider and benefits that could come through this criteria. And I would imagine there's an incredible amount of modeling that goes into all of that as well. Thank you for sharing that, because it's so hard to be able to see behind the veil or inside what we often refer to as the black box of like how at an economic level this all starts to make sense, right? I want to touch on one more point that is in the zeitgeist right now before I move into sort of the learning, leadership, and legacy and wrap up the conversation. And I'd be remiss not to ask, because you're a part of Shell, because there's such an investment by oil and gas into the multiplicity of ways that energy is generated, harvested, stored, delivered. Do you have, and I haven't asked you this before, so it may fall flat, but do you have a thesis on, or do you have a vision towards how hydrogen and the topic of green hydrogen might play into the macroeconomic influence that renewables is able to push forward?
So we're fortunate in the solar space to be able to compete on a purely economic basis today anywhere in the U.S.
Yeah.
So the fact that we bring all of these ancillary benefits is just a huge positive. Hydrogen is still very, very much where solar was maybe 10 years ago. It needs some support. But I do think there's an integral role for hydrogen as part of our energy transition. And I think you need the players that have the balance sheets like the oil and gas companies to be leaders in that development. So it's interesting, Shell's brought some successful green hydrogen on in Europe. I think they're really looking to replicate that in the US. They would I don't want to put myself in Shell's shoes, but I think they would say the market needs to send a market signal that it's, those are big capital expenditures. Right. So we either need to do that through government policy or the economics need to shift. But there's a real opportunity to get in front of where the green hydrogen facilities are going to be and think about how do we power those with renewable electrons generated by low-cost solar energy. So there's a huge synergy there for us going forward.
Non-obvious for several folks who maybe don't understand how all this works. What would the green hydrogen be used for?
It's a great energy storage vehicle. It could be, I don't think it'll ever be part of, I think electric has won the game for passenger transportation, but for commercial vehicles, hydrogen could be a solution, especially 18-wheeler truck transportation. And it's a good storage of energy. So we're going to need that. It's portable. The challenge with electricity is it's got to be consumed as it's generated. So having these vehicles like hydrogen that can be clean and converted is going to be a meaningful tool in the toolkit.
Yeah, I would encourage folks to go back and listen to the conversations that we had with Fluence as well, how they think about the virtual transmission. I think that plays a little bit in here to think about it at a meta level, how energy is transformed and reused. Because when we hypothesize about renewables, and when we go back to traditional fossil fuels saying, oh, the problem with renewables is they're intermittent, technology around green hydrogen, as one example, gives us the ability to convert the energy in the similar way that historically, and certainly countries in Latin America will appreciate this, we've done through physical properties like water being pumped uphill or stored in a reservoir, right? So I'd encourage you all to think about it, and we'll explore the topic of green hydrogen further here on Suncast. I really appreciate that answer, and I don't expect that you're going to give me sort of the Shell position or perhaps even the playbook, but just what you've talked about for me is illustrative of where, sort of like you said, where is this positioned relative to what we can exercise today, what we can put into the ground today, and I think that's what's taken traditional energy, put them on their heels, is just how quickly, compared to nuclear, you can deploy these assets. And the question becomes, okay, well, if I can deploy them this quickly, why would I take 15 years to develop an alternative energy generation system? Let's turn to that stack of literature on your nightstand. I know that you're a voracious reader. You talked a bit about what you're reading right now. Instead of what's on your nightstand, I'd love to hear, we believe that reading, that leaders are readers, and that we can glean insights from what others have learned and distilled into wisdom and left over the generations. Is there a particular book, or maybe a couple of them, that either you've gifted the most or have impacted you particularly about in the way that you approach work or life generally?
I do give books a lot as gifts, but it's tends to be very temporal. If I read something and find it interesting, I think of the friend who might share that interest. And Matt Beasley, who I've mentioned several times, it's interesting because every once in a while I get a package from Amazon and I'm like, what is this? And he's done the same. He sent me a book that he just read that he thought would be pertinent.
I love it.
I mean, I think that's a great sign of that you're thinking of somebody. If you read a book and you say, this book is right for this friend, that's a great thing to do, and I always encourage people, give great gifts.
Yeah. What's a book that you sent Matt?
You know, it is interesting. I have not sent, probably Dirt to Soil would be the last book I gave him, and I don't think he took it out of his office. But it was on regenerative energy. It was written by Gabe, I'm going to get his last name wrong, but he's a friend of Will Harris's at White Oak Pastures. It really talked about how he used regenerative ranching to improve his soil, create a more resilient ecosystem on the ag side. Matt's my partner in crime on helping us flush out our regenerative energy land management practices. So I was like, you got to read this so we can talk about it.
Gabe Brown, we'll link to it in the show notes. Any book that, as you think about, like maybe Governor Bredesen or someone else recommended to you, or you read that unlocked something for you about the way business is done, or helped you think more clearly about leadership or CEO position?
I referenced Shoe Dog earlier, and I thought, one, I was very surprised that Phil Knight was so thoughtful and honest in his writing. And then two, it was very insightful to me of how long a journey it was before he crossed this period where Nike was an unstoppable machine. That really helped me feel better, because 10 years feels like a while. You know, we've been at this, and you can either say, man, I'm tired, or in my case, I'm more excited today than I was when we started the company, because we've answered a lot of the questions that I had early on, and now there's just this field of opportunity. It's like, how do I take what I learned? It's almost like that second startup company, because I really feel like the space has changed so much. So I do recommend that. And then it's interesting, read a book, Boys in the Boat, and it's just about being part of a crew team. And it's not a leadership book. It's a biography. But the whole thing of how this group of individuals came together, trained together, and eventually won Olympic gold against all odds, and building that teamwork and camaraderie by becoming kind of one team in the moment. Not a true leadership book, but it's the quintessential definition of leadership and building a team. So I would encourage you, if you've not read it, it's very readable and is a great one. I share it with friends who went to University of Washington and anyone who's interested in crew.
Do you have, or have you cultivated a routine or habit that maybe it's a morning routine or a consistent practice in your life that gives you leverage?
So 2 things. One, I get up early. I've got young kids.
How early is early?
Generally right around 5 every morning. Yeah. So I'm the one who gets the boys ready for school and and then my wife actually gets up and then brings them to school. Yeah. But I enjoy. I'm a big coffee drinker. You and I have talked about that. So I enjoy having my coffee. I'm a complete traditionalist. I get the paper, New York Times, and I read it every morning before I get my boys up. Yeah. And then I get them up and get them ready for school. And I find the Times covers enough different topics that if you read most of the stories that catch your eye, you get a good feel for what's going on in different areas. Just kind of one, if something comes up in a professional conversation, you've at least somewhat heard of it or can speak to it. And then 2, I think as leaders, part of our job is keeping fresh perspectives and thinking about what's around that next corner, what the opportunities are. And if all you do is read trade press, and I'm very guilty of that, I read a lot of it. If all you do is read trade press, you miss those big macro things that are going on. So I treasure my time alone in the morning. And then because my parents always had dinner together, I try to always be home for dinner with the family.
Time's dinner.
It varies. We've pushed it late a lot of times, but we try to have it together because it's a fundamental part of communicating. I don't want to miss. My kids. This business is part of our family. Like it intrudes on almost every element of what we do. Oftentimes in a positive way. You know, we've a lot of the team members here, like uncles and aunts to my kids, but you've got to carve out time to listen to your children and to be focused on them. So I don't bring my phone. I don't even have it in my pocket because I can feel it vibrating at the dinner table. So I treasure and set aside that time for the family.
That's beautiful. I'd be remiss if I don't ask. As I sit in what is in some ways a showcase of the progress and awards and accolades of the business, and you talk about your focus on family, look out over Nissan Stadium, a living testament to Governor Bredesen's legacy. What are you most proud of in your career?
I'm most proud of what we're going to do in the future. This team that we have put together, as idealistic as it was to start a solar company in a part of the country where there was no solar, that was the easy part. Building a team in a part of the country where there was no experienced solar professionals to draw from was the bigger challenge. And most of our long-term employees, they bet on a company that was small. They moved their families to Nashville, Tennessee. None of them are from here. The faith that those individuals put in our company and our leadership creates a bond that you just want to pay back in a very meaningful way. And I really feel like we've built this foundational framework where we can tangibly see the good that we're doing in the communities where we build projects. There's nothing like I love getting our teams together and sharing, frankly, the impact. We sponsor scholarships in these low-income communities. We, in one community, very small community, Bluffton, Georgia, one of their fine young people ended up being a casualty and going off to serve in the military. And when you lose a young man out of a small community who's a leader, that's really impactful in a town that has 400 people maybe. When we read the story, I didn't have an opportunity to meet this individual, but when we read the story that they were trying to build a monument to commemorate and acknowledge his service and sacrifice, we wrote what I considered a relatively small check but it ended up being a third of the cost of building this. And Will Harris and a relative of Will's were the other two leaders. And what I love is we do our own podcast here at Silicon Ranch, the Ranch Report, and I have a podcast where we talk about our armed services and our heroes, and we actually interview the mother as part of that story. And it's incredibly moving, not just the impact it had on her, but on our teammates, some of whom have been in the armed services, that go and bring flowers to the memorial every time. When you build a company the right way, with the culture about doing the right thing, and we always say we're all about square corners. We'll take a smaller profit to deliver on a promise that we make. That ethos, really, you're proud to be a part of it. You love seeing it reflected in the team that you build, because we attract a certain type of employee. And it's humbling. It's interesting. I feel very humbled when we have our town halls and I'm talking to our teams to realize the incredible people that are sitting here counting on me and our other leaders to make good decisions. So it's a meaningful responsibility. I'm very proud of it, but I think I always say our best days are ahead, and I believe that more now than I ever have before.
I hope to get the opportunity at some point to highlight some of the remarkable team that you have referenced, Beasley and Rob Hamilton, who worked for Al Gore. I mean, you've got just a tremendous team here who helped to tell the story, but it's always a privilege and honor to be able to sit down with the co-founder and hear from your perspective how this all came together and where it's going. If this story has inspired others in the community, is there a way that you would encourage them to reach out or to connect with you and the team?
I read every email I get. So I'd say email. Beasley is always trying to, I'm terrible on social media, but he's got me on LinkedIn. So send me a LinkedIn.
Please become his 13th connection on LinkedIn. Goodness sake.
And choose the one that says Silicon Ranch, because I still have 2 from my Commissioner of Revenue days I don't know how to turn off. So, I love, I've really, this is incredible to sit down and have this dialogue with you and appreciate what you've done, which is, I asked you early on before we got on mic, when do you get to be interviewed? Because I would actually love to hear your story, and maybe we can get Beasley or someone or Rob to hold the mic and turn it your way, because we shared some good stories before we undertook this. But
on the Ranch Report.
Oh my God!
There you go.
There it is.
That's it, Rob.
The Ranch Report is our internal thing. Silicon Ranch Radio. So I'm going to call Jim Bissell does that for us with Rob and Beasley. I'm going to tell him I have secured our next guest. We don't quite have your audience base, but hopefully everyone tune in to Silicon Ranch Radio.
Yeah,
so one plug I'll make.
There we go. I'm happy to give you, that's one of the questions I ask, how can the Suncast audience help? And I would encourage you all to not only share, as we always say, this story if it's inspired you, but definitely tune in to how Silicon Ranch is impacting the communities where they work and invest, which you can hear through the Silicon Ranch Radio. I'm inspired by the work that Rob and the team are doing to communicate in unique and novel ways, the impact that you guys have. Well, I always end with one final question that I call bold predictions. So here it is. Reagan Farr, what one thing do you see happening in the market that perhaps nobody else is tracking? What's in your crystal ball?
I don't think my view is unique, but I told you there's a scaling problem that I don't think our industry's totally gotten their arms around. And I really do think you're going to see meaningful consolidation in our space going forward. And institutionalization. It's still a very entrepreneurial space, and there's a lot of room for that entrepreneurial growth. But as we start delivering things at scale, I think it will lend itself more and more to better capitalize more institutionalized players in the space.
Reagan Farr is the CEO of Silicon Ranch Corporation, one of the co-founders, and we have been regaled and informed, delighted, in fact, to hear not only how the company came together, but the ways in unique corners of our economy Silicon Ranch is carrying forward the vision that many of us have for the energy transition that we all are pushing so diligently towards to impact climate change. I'm honored for the opportunity, the invitation by Rob and Krista and your team to be able to come and sit with you. My first interview in 2 years in person. I'm loving this opportunity. I can certainly understand why the folks that I admire, like Rich Roll and Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss, often run into the 2 and 3 hour space, because these conversations can just unfold in ways that are unexpected when we're face to face. So thank you for that privilege.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm a big fan. It's always fun to me to see a face to go with the name that you, or to go with the voice that you hear on these podcasts. So thank you. It's actually been probably more fun for me than it's been for you. I've really enjoyed it, and look forward to having you on Silicon Ranch Radio.
Fantastic.
Whew. I learned a lot of things from Reagan Farr when I got to sit down with him and his team in Nashville. It was so much fun. Reagan, Krista, Rob, Matt, thank you for inviting me into your home and having the presence to sit and tell your story. It was such an enjoyable time together. My hope is that you too, dear listener, have been able to saddle up to the table right next to us, eavesdrop on our conversation, and come away with some earth-moving truths of your own. What were they? Would you be open to sharing them with me and the rest of the Solar Warriors in the Suncast tribe? I know Reagan would sure be honored if you posted a comment on my post of this episode, or perhaps even create your own post over on LinkedIn expressing how this 2-part episode landed for you. What turned out to be the thing that surprised or inspired you the most from the Silicon Ranch story? Let us know, please. Be sure to tag us so we are aware that you posted. If it's not a comment, of course, on my own post over there. And of course, if you're eager to keep learning, then you, my fellow Philomath, can find the resources and highlights from this discussion, along with the social media links, book recommendations, and more from this and every other episode in the show notes at mysuncast.com. And yes, as I've teased, and should be obvious, we are rounding a momentous milestone here on Suncast. The very next conversation on the show is the 400th. I've invited a very special guest back, my old friend and fellow Solar Warrior, Mike Silvestrini. If you're unfamiliar with Mike, well, you should go give episode number 85 a listen, back from May 2018, where I detailed how Mike sold the then largest U.S. solar developer, Green Skies. He's back to build on his incredible journey, but also help us celebrate 400 times we've hit the publish button here on Suncast. It's a not to miss episode. Thanks once again to our sponsors for helping keep this content free to you. You can show them love and learn more about their offer over at mysuncast.com/sponsor. That's also where you can learn how you could partner with us to reach thousands of solar warriors and clean tech champions just like this every week. Remember, you are what you listen to. Thanks again for showing up for the 399th time, Solar Warrior. It is half the battle.